Well, hello, friends, and hopefully future friends, and thank you so much for joining me today to talk about things to consider as you are contemplating or doing the collection and documentation of language outcome data. My name is Allison Setti. As Will said, I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I am currently the director of Odyssey, which is the Outcomes and Developmental Data Assistance Center for EHDI programs. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about all questions that should be considered as you are thinking about collecting language outcome data and as you're thinking about documenting that data. So who, what, where, when, why, how? Who's going to collect that data? Where will it be collected? What instruments will you be using to collect language outcome data? When will you do it? Why would you even bother? And how would you go about this process? So let me pause for a minute to talk about the term best practice. I would say the term best practice is something that's batted around fairly frequently and maybe isn't always used exactly in the way that it was intended. So best practice implies that we're all more or less in agreement about the best way to do something, or at least a team of experts has come together and using evidence has determined what the best way is to do something. And I would argue that in terms of the collection of language outcome data and the documentation of outcome data, there is not an established best practice. So those words may inadvertently slip out of my mouth today, but be aware that if they do, that this is my conception of what best practice is, my opinion of what best practice is, and that we really don't to date have a single best practice when it comes to this particular endeavor. So what do I base my opinion on? Well, I've been very fortunate to live in Colorado for the last almost 30 years, and Colorado has a very long history of statewide collection and use of language outcome data with children who are deaf or hard of hearing from birth to 3, and at different points in time going all the way through preschool. So I came here 28 years ago. I joined Christy Yoshinaga Itano and Arlene Stredler Brown, who have pioneered the effort here in Colorado to systematically collect language outcome data across our entire state. So for the last 28 years, I've had the privilege of being able to continue with their vision and their work in this area. Additionally, over the last decade or so, I've been involved with 2 national centers, both supported by the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. The first project was called NCHAM, and the current project is called Odyssey. Both of those projects involve collecting language outcomes, not just here in our state of Colorado, but supporting and working with programs across the United States in this particular endeavor. So I've had an opportunity to work with a variety of programs, to talk with them about what some of the obstacles are, some of the successes that they've had, strategies that they've used, what they've liked, what they haven't liked, and that's helped to inform my opinion. So Odyssey is the Outcomes and Developmental Data Assistance Center for EHDI programs. We're working currently with 17 different programs across the United States to collect language outcome data. We're not currently partnering with any new states because we are in the last year of this project. So let's start with our why. Why are we even talking about this? Why would we want to collect language outcomes? What would be some of the benefits of this endeavor? And I'm going to talk about it in terms of what might be some of the whys for an intervention program who wants to collect outcomes across their program. And I'm also going to talk about the why for state EHDI programs, why an entire state through their state EHDI program might want to collect intervention and language outcomes. So for an individual intervention program, one of the biggest benefits of collecting language outcomes is to benefit those individual children and families that the program works with, because through the collection of language outcomes, you're able to monitor the progress of individual children. You can take the objective data that you're obtaining from an individual child, use that information that you've obtained to make a variety of decisions. And those decisions might be things around how frequent the intervention services would be based on the levels of the child, based on the child's challenges and their strengths, who would be the best interventionist to pair with that particular child or family. And over time, as you're looking at the amount of progress that a child's making and seeing if they're making the expected gains over time, you can make modifications potentially to things like their communication plan if you feel that's necessary. Some other reasons why an intervention program might want to collect language outcomes is beyond the level of the individual child. They may want to look program-wide for accountability and evaluation purposes. So looking at the outcomes across an entire program allows the program to look at where they might want to make improvements, as well as where they might have strengths that they could potentially share with others. It informs them about personnel prep needs and what areas might their providers benefit from extra education, extra training. And it also can provide data if an individual intervention program is making funding requests, applying for grants, or responding to people who are already funding their program. It provides data that they can show about the successes of their program. In addition, in many states, often through Lead K initiatives, sometimes through other means, there are mandates to report program-wide data. So some states, often, again, an outgrowth of Lead K initiatives, have House or Senate bills that require the collection of language outcomes and the reporting of those outcomes to a committee and or the community. And for Part C agencies, often the state Part C office requires periodic measuring of language outcomes and reporting those results program-wide. And in turn, those state Part C agencies have reporting requirements to the Office of Special Education on the children's language outcomes. Let's talk a little bit about why a state EHDI program might want to collect language outcomes. The collection of language outcomes by the state EHDI program really completes a circle that up until now has been about 3/4 complete. So state EHDI programs have been collecting data on hearing screening, identification of hearing loss. Many programs also collect information about intervention, whether it's the start of intervention, the IFSP date, etc. But we're just now starting to get into the territory of finishing off that circle and looking at the results of all of that great work that EHDI programs have been doing. What are the language outcomes of the children that have been screened? Their hearing loss has been confirmed. They're in intervention programs. And that can all be put together in what's an already established public health data system. And it would be so nice to have all of those pieces because then you can look at those pieces in relation to one another. So examining the association of different EHDI benchmarks, was the child's hearing differences identified by the time they were 3 months of age? Were they in an intervention program by the time they were 6 months of age? And then how does that relate to those later language outcomes that the child is demonstrating? By having all of that information in one system, we can look at those questions. We can also look at identifying health disparities because within the EHDI database, we have other information about the child and the family. And we can be looking at, are there subgroups that are at higher risk for language delays if we have that language outcome data in the database? And where should we be directing our attention? Some other motivations for an EHDI program to collect language outcomes is it really provides an excellent opportunity for them to be partnering with other agencies in the state that are doing EHDI-related activities. So for example, partnering with the Part C programs that are in their state that are providing early intervention, partnering with specialty programs who are serving children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And most recently, there's been an increased interest in this topic because federal funding is beginning to focus on language outcomes. So there's a recent HRSA supplement that 20 states have recently received that's all about language outcomes and collecting language outcomes. And the next 5-year HRSA funding cycle is also including as one of its activities the collection of language outcomes. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the framework for the remaining part of this presentation. So we're going to look at those WH questions: who, what, where, we already talked about why, when and how, about language outcomes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about, let's say, the who question. What do you want to consider when you're thinking about who is going to actually administer assessments that are going to allow you to collect language outcomes. After we talk a little bit about considerations, I'm going to present what I would recommend. So again, the world according to Allison, what would be my recommendation as you're thinking about who or what or when? I'll describe why I would recommend that, and then I'll present some alternatives because you might not agree with my first choice, or you may feel that it's just not something that's feasible in your program or in your state to do. But we will talk a little bit about, if you do go with an alternative option, what are some potential pitfalls to those that you need to keep in mind and potentially control for, or at least acknowledge as you move forward. So let's start with the who. Who will facilitate the assessment with the family? To collect language outcomes, somebody has to gather them in the first place. And my strong recommendation in this regard is that it would be the interventionist who's working with the family. So if the family is engaged in an early intervention program, in my opinion, the ideal person to assess the child's language abilities would be the interventionist who already knows the child or who will be getting to know the child as they work with them on a regular basis. Why do I say that? One, I think it's the most efficient and cost-effective way to collect outcomes because that person's already meeting with the family. They already have a relationship with the family. And typically it's a very trusted relationship that they have with the family. And so not only does that make the experience better for everybody, but also if you're looking at completion rates and how many families are going to participate in an assessment process, that percentage is likely to be greatly increased if it's the interventionist and not a stranger who's offering the assessment to the family. Also, I really like the option of the interventionist collecting the outcome data because it's more likely to be used for the direct benefit of the child and the family. So rather than it just being a piece of data that goes into a database and perhaps is useful in answering larger public health questions, which of course is valuable, but it may not have direct benefit to the child and family if the assessment is not being done by somebody who's going to be visiting and working with the family regularly. Also, a big piece is increasing the validity of the results because the interventionist is knowledgeable about the child's skills. They're visiting with the child, they're visiting with the family, they're learning all about the child. And having that second eye, a knowledgeable eye, so you have the parents' input, which is invaluable. Of course, they know their child, but having a second eye on the data you're collecting to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of what are these questions asking on this assessment? Are the answers we're providing actually responding to the questions? Are there misunderstandings that only a person who knows the child might be able to identify? It also definitely shortens administration time because many language assessments have basals and ceilings, which means that you want to start the assessment right around the point where the child is able to do the skills, but hopefully you've picked a spot where you're not going to have to ask a lot of questions because rather quickly you'll get to a point where they're not yet able to do the skills on the assessment. So being able to plug in and start at that ideal point is a huge time saver. It might mean the difference between literally having to start at number 1, which means you might have to administer 20 questions, to being able to know, I don't have to start at 1. I know the child can do number 1 through 10. I can start at number 10, work my way forward, and I've just cut my time in half. So it definitely shortens administration time if there's a basal ceiling piece to the language assessment, which many assessments have. And even if there's not, the fact that the interventionist knows the child already, they can answer, if they know, they've seen, observed the child do certain skills, or they're very confident that the child is not at a certain place in development yet and is not yet able to do other skills, they can complete much of it on their own without taking the family's time for all of the questions. And then they can work together with the family to look at those items that are a little more, they might not be certain about. Not sure the child can do it, they might be able to do it. Those would be the ones they would want to take their session time to discuss with the family, get the family's input about the child's skills. So If that's not possible, which it may not be, what are some other options? So some other ideas, if you don't have the luxury of being able to pair with an intervention program, or for whatever reason, the early interventionist is not able to be the person collecting the language outcomes, another option would be to hire somebody that your agency or your program would hire an evaluator. And they would be the ones who would go out to do the assessment, might do it virtually with a family. Who would be the kinds of people a program might want to think about hiring? Parent guides might be an option. So if you have a guide by your side program in your state, parent guides may be effective evaluators. Periodic home visitors might be an option. So for example, some EHDI programs have public health nurses that visit with the family. Certainly any child connected to Part C is going to have a service coordinator that visits with the family periodically. Some programs have consultants. So for example, an EHDI program may partner with a Part C program to provide support specifically around children who are deaf or hard of hearing. That consultant may occasionally do joint visits with the early interventionist, and that person might be the right one to do the assessment with a family. Another potential option would be to use grad students and to partner with your local university. This is a great opportunity for graduate students to get clinical hours, a course under supervision by supervisors at their university. And if they're in a program that's a speech pathology program, early childhood program, early childhood special ed, possibly even audiology, there might be a lot of interest at your local university in a partnership that would provide a great experience for the graduate students and potentially a low cost or no cost evaluator for your program. Another option is to hire somebody who's more of a coordinator and send assessments out via mail or email or a link in a text to a web-based form that the family would then fill out. So in that case, you don't necessarily have somebody who has expertise in language assessment, but somebody who's well organized and good with families and would want to do sort of that kind of a coordination. Of course, there's only certain language assessments that would work in that context. Some assessments need to be administered by a person who's facilitating the assessment, but there are options that are complete parent reports that can be done via mail or email, or again, a link to the form that's sent in a text to a family. So if you do end up going with one of these alternative options, I just want to talk about a few things that you'll want to keep in mind to make sure that that this isn't going to be something where in the end you'll be disappointed in what you did. So one option, one consideration, and I've already mentioned this, is that the assessment's likely to take longer if it's not the interventionist working with the family on the assessment, because the evaluator can't contribute. They can't answer any questions before they even meet with the family. They can't validate what the family's saying to make sure that the family understood the question, because they don't know what the child's skill level is. So that checks and balances will be missing. That does reduce the validity of the results. It's nice to have two eyes on the assessment, two eyes who know the child and know their skills. And if you are hiring an outside person who doesn't know the child or the family, you're not going to have that second look or that validation. Also, if it's not somebody that's working with the family that the family knows and trusts, and the family feels like what they're doing is actually not just going to benefit the greater good, but is going to actually benefit their individual child, families are going to be less willing, or less families will be willing. Particularly if you go with a mail, email, text sort of situation, we all know those have low response rates. Certainly the coordinator would need to do more than just send it out once. There would have to be a reminder system put into place. But as I'm sure everybody's aware, these days, if you call somebody on the phone, they don't usually pick it up, especially if they don't recognize the number. A lot of people aren't particularly interested in their email anymore. And people often are ignoring texts that are coming from people that they don't know as well. So I would say that would be an absolute kind of last option if there's nothing else that would be feasible, because you're likely to have quite a low response rate to that. So let's move on to the what. what assessment will you select? What do you need to consider as you're thinking about what assessment you'll be using to collect the language outcomes? So if you're partnering with another program, for example, if an EHDI program is partnering with a Part C program or with a specialty program that provides intervention services to families who have children who are deaf or hard of hearing, the first question is, what are they using? Because if you're partnering with an intervention program, it is highly likely that they are doing something to assess the language abilities of the child. So you want to find out what that is. You want to find out if they like it and if they want to continue, or if they're considering switching things up and trying something else out. As you're considering assessments, it's very, very important to look at the kind of score the assessment provides. So there are a variety of language assessments available for children in the birth to 3 range, and some of them will provide age scores. Some of them are checklist oriented and just are telling you the skills a child can and cannot do. You could potentially count up those skills and get a raw score. Some of the tests provide percentile ranks. Some tests provide standard scores. And if you're thinking about collection of data program-wide and using it to document not just how an individual child is doing, but how children across an entire program or across an entire state are doing, the kind of score you get is going to be really critical to what you're going to be able to do or what you're going to be able to say about the outcomes of children, not just one individual child, where there's a lot more flexibility about what you use that might be useful at the individual child level, but not everything is going to be useful to you at a program-wide level. And you also have to think about the level of training that's required to administer that assessment. Is this something that's strictly parent report and literally you could hand it to a family, give some instructions, and nobody would need to facilitate the assessment? Is it an assessment where somebody knowledgeable needs to be available to guide the family through the process? Or is it an administered assessment where there has to be somebody really knowledgeable who's going to sit down with the child and actually do the assessment with the child directly? So other considerations you want to be thinking about, again, can the family complete this entirely on their own? Or will a professional need to facilitate it? And then if the professional does need to facilitate it, of course, that brings you to all the who questions. Another very important question, and this really requires looking at the assessment instruments you're considering, getting the test forms, and reading through all the items. And one of the biggest issues that you need to consider is that, is it clear in this assessment, or can you make it clear because you have a facilitator who's going to be working with the family, that you want a positive response to any language skills that are demonstrated, regardless of if they're demonstrated in spoken language or in sign language. And because the vast majority of birth to 3 language tests were not designed with children who are deaf or hard of hearing in mind, typically items are going to say things like, does the child say 10 words? Or does your child say 10 words? And we certainly want to make sure that we're capturing not only if the child says 10 words, but also if they sign 10 words. And if this has been mailed to a family or there's very little assistance in guiding the family through the assessment, families might feel like, well, okay, it says, and right now my child is expressing themselves primarily with sign language, so I guess I'm going to have to say no to that item, when really they should be saying yes. And you'll have a gross underrepresentation of their language abilities unless it's very clear as you're going through the questions, as the family goes through the questions, that we're not only talking about spoken words, but we're also talking about signed words, signed sentences. Another piece that you want to be thinking about as you're thinking about your what is, besides a language assessment, do you also want to take this opportunity to maybe gather some additional demographic information? Because whatever database you may currently have, whether it's a Part C database, an intervention program database, an EHDI database, likely your database has some demographic information already. But there may be other things that you want to look at with this data that you're collecting above and beyond what you already have. So particularly when we're looking at the question of health disparity, Let's say, for example, you're very interested in looking at, are there differences in outcomes for children based on their parents' level of education? That might not be something that you have in the database, but if that's a question that you hope to answer with your language outcomes to identify potential health disparities, this is the opportunity to create, probably short because you don't want it to be too lengthy, but to add some information to the database you already have or the database you're considering creating so that you can examine the questions that you want to examine. Because there's nothing more disappointing than spending a lot of time collecting data and then realizing at the end that some of your burning questions you really wanted to explore, you actually can't because you don't have the information that you need to look at them. So I would consider taking, if you're launching or you're wanting to enhance a program you already have, looking at language outcomes, to really think about if you have all the information above and beyond language that you want to be exploring. So what are my recommendations when you select a language assessment? Number one, I think it's very important that you have a consistent assessment across all the children, whether it's all the children in the state, all the children in your intervention program, if you're limiting it just to a single intervention program. Consistency is super important. So you don't have one person doing one assessment, a different person doing a different assessment. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about why that's so important. The other thing that I would strongly recommend is that you select an assessment that's standardized and norm referenced. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Also, an assessment that includes parent input, I think, is extremely important. And ideally, if time permits, you would want to select two assessments. One that is often referred to as a 5-domain assessment. It's more of a general look at the child's development across a variety of domains. So you have the opportunity to measure how a child is progressing in their motor skills, in their cognitive skills, and also in their communication skills, and their adaptive or self-help independent skills. That provides some really nice information, again, if you want to be looking at public health questions and what influences language development, what might put some children at more risk, to not just be measuring a single domain, but be looking across domains to see how those domains overlap with each other or inform each other or are associated with each other. But you also want to have a specific language assessment because these 5-domain tests are much more general and they're not going to take the deep dive into language, which is your primary purpose if you're collecting language outcomes, as an assessment that's specific to language would do. So if you're just going to, you only have the bandwidth to do one assessment, or that is a decision you want to make, I would say go with the specific language assessment. And the other piece is you want to pick one that's known to be sensitive to language gaps or delays, particularly in children who are deaf or hard of hearing, not an assessment that has the reputation of testing high or under-identifying children. So let's talk about consistency. It's the old combining apples with apples story. As I said, there are many language tests out there to choose from, but they're each a little different in terms of what component of language they might be measuring, or even if on the surface it appears that they're both measuring the same component of language, the questions are not going to be identical. And so you really can't validly combine a group of, 10 children who did one assessment with another 10 children who did something else, and then the other 10 did another thing. And if you kind of, if you're more a hearing person and you want to think of it from hearing result perspective, it'd be kind of like saying, okay, I want to look at the functioning of the ear. I want to measure the functioning of the ear. And I want to see how many of the 100 children that we're going to assess are in the average range in terms of their functioning, their ear functioning. If you said 90% of the children were in the average range, and that was because 45% of them passed a tympanogram, had tympanogram numbers in the average range, and the other half had hearing thresholds in the average range on a pure tone test, you can see that wouldn't really make any sense. That you could say, oh, I have 45% of children who are in the average range on their tympanograms, and I have 45% of children who are in the average range on a pure tone screen. But you can't then say, I have 90% of children whose ear functioning is in the average range, because those two tests are measuring really very different things about how the ear is functioning. And the same thing goes with language tests. You can't be combining a test that looked at expressive vocabulary with another test that looked at comprehension of complex sentences, and then another one that involved auditory short-term memory. And again, even if on the surface they appear to measure the same thing, and even honestly, if the questions were exactly identical, which they would never be, but suppose that they were very similar, they're going to have two different normative samples that they've done the test on. And depending on that makeup of that normative sample, was it a diverse sample of children? Was it a sample of children that skewed more towards majority race and also high levels of parent education and high SES? Those two normative samples are going to be very different. And so the scores that you're going to get when you compare your individual child's results to the normative sample are going to be very different. So as I said, there are tests that are known to test high. There's an article that was written that I loved about a particular test that's very commonly administered to young children, and it said, even a potato would score in the average range on this expressive language test. And it was a comment to how the test was under-identifying children that had actual language delay. So ideally, you want to avoid those tests, but if nothing else, you do not want to combine results from some children on a test that's known to test high with other children who took a test where that test is known to be very rigorous and much more likely to identify gaps. And the children are likely to score probably more at really the level they're at, but it may be a lower level than another test might say. Norm referenced, let's talk a little bit about that. So by norm referenced, what we mean is that when the test was developed, that test was given to hundreds, hopefully thousands of children. And when you give the test to your individual child, you can compare that child's performance with other children who were the same exact age who were part of the norming sample. So the beauty of the normative test, the norm reference test, when you're collecting language outcomes across a program, is that you're not just going to get age scores, you're not just going to get a raw score, you're actually going to get a standard score or a percentile rank that's going to tell you where the child falls in the wide variation that we know exists in the language skills of very young children. So you'll be able to make statements about the percentage of children who were in the average range. You'll be able to make subjective determinations about what you consider the average range to be. So you can look at what are the percentage of children who fall within a standard deviation of the mean. What are the percentage of children who are significantly delayed? They fall below the 10th percentile. You have a lot of options of how you can look at your data, but the key is that you'll be able to make statements about not just how many they got right or approximately at what age level they appear to be functioning, but where do they fall in that wide variation of typical language development. Parent input is extremely important as you're assessing children in the birth to 3 range. Parents have deep knowledge of their children's skills. It greatly improves the accuracy and validity of your assessment, especially at this very young age. You can imagine that if you were to administer a test to a 2-year-old, how likely are they really going to be to show you everything they can do? And it can range from, well, they came pretty close, they were in a good mood, they had just gotten up from a nice nap, and they're feeling great, and for whatever reason they like you, to a complete disaster where they are cranky, they are hungry, they don't take well to new people in their environment, or they're just not in the mood today to show you their skills. So involving the parent is critical. More parent involvement is required if the person who's administering the assessment or asking the questions doesn't know the child's skills. Then you're really relying pretty much 100% on the parent's input. And it's a nice opportunity for the family as well, because especially if you give assessments over time, that helps with their skills in terms of observing their child and being able to talk about little steps that their child is making as they're learning language. So what are some other options? So if you say, this isn't going to happen, Allison, sorry, you're out of your mind. we can't do a consistent assessment across our entire state. We can't do 2 different tests. We can't do something that somebody's going to have to administer. So what other options are available to you? So you could do a 5-domain assessment only. I had mentioned I would lean, if you were only going to do one, towards a language-specific test, but doing a 5-domain assessment is not a bad idea necessarily. But just know that those tests are more general and they tend to underestimate language delay. So in other words, they overestimate the child's abilities. So you might not be getting the most accurate picture of how children are doing across your program or state. Maybe you have to use different assessments for different children. That's just going to be the way it is. We can't come to agreement about using one thing across a program or across a state. If that's the case, the important thing is that you create a field in the database where it's very clear what assessment was administered, so that when it comes time to analyze or report on the results, you can divide your groups up into children who had the same assessment, so that you are comparing apples to apples. Now, you're probably going to end up with several apples because you're going to have had different assessments. But you don't want to be combining a child who did a preschool language scale with one who did a MacArthur with another who did a Daisy. But you could have 3 different groups. So you could report on results of language outcomes using a MacArthur, results of language outcomes using a Daisy, and results of language outcomes using the preschool language scale. But you need to make sure that you're marking that in the database so that you can do those subsamples or subgroups later. Other potential issue that could come up is that you could say, you know what, my favorite test is not norm referenced, and I'm not willing to switch, or I'm partnering with an intervention program and they're not willing to switch. So a criterion referenced assessment would be next best because that typically provides age scores. But in that case, what you want to consider is that you always need to have a field that includes the child's chronological age, because when they took the test, because an age score in and of itself is totally meaningless unless you know how old the child was. So is a 24-month age score good? Well, it's great if the child's 20 months, but it's not so great if the child's 30 months. So you always need to look at an age score relative to how old they were when they took the test. And so I would advise for your database that you create a language quotient field. And what you would do there is you take that language age they got on the assessment, you divide it by how old they were when they took the assessment, and then you end up with a number that you can compare across children because it's looking at their language age relative to how old they were. So basically, if you got 100 for your quotient, that would mean the child's language age was exactly what their chronological age was. And scores above 100 would mean the language age was higher. Scores below 100 would mean their language age was lower. What I would strongly advise is that you do not select an assessment where you just get a count of skills. So, because that's really hard to do anything with. Because most tests where it's just a listing of skills, it's not necessarily that every, say, 6 months you expect 10 more skills. It might be in one 6-month period you expect 7 or 8 skills, but then another 6-month period, actually in this list of skills you expect 15. So there's not really a way to look across an entire program when you just have a raw score count of how many items a child can do. Other options, and this would be if you really are constrained to doing something fairly slim, that's not going to have a lot of detailed information, but would be a picture to some extent of the child's language skills. So Part C agencies need to report to the Office of Special Ed what progress category a child fell in when they exit their program. And that's just a 5-point scale from A to E, but it's something that if you're partnering with a Part C program should be readily available. To get to that 5 scale A through E, many Part C programs use a 7-point scale, and they use that's called the Child Outcome Summary. They look at that across 3 developmental areas, one of which typically focuses on language, or at least certainly includes language. And so using those Child Outcome Summary numbers is another option if you're limited to just a very small overview of the child's language skills. So when are these assessments going to be administered? That's another big question. And just want to put out a caution that it's often appealing to think about, well, I want to see how they're doing at the end of early intervention, when they're 3. How are they doing as they exit the early intervention program, move on to preschool, Part B services, etc. And that's appealing, and also saying 3 years old is kind of a straightforward, nice round number. But keep in mind that early intervention programs typically stop working with families and children the day the child turns 3. And many of them are very, very strict about this, where truly the early interventionist can no longer be working with the family in any capacity after the child's 3rd birthday. And so if your model is utilizing early interventionists as part of the picture, they're not going to be able typically to do the assessment at 36 months. And in fact, they probably aren't even going to be interested in doing the assessment at 35 months because now they only have maybe 1 to 4 more visits with the family. And likely their focus is not going to be on assessment in those last couple of opportunities they have to meet with the family. And when you think about usefulness, well, at that point, all the transition has pretty much wrapped up. So if you want the assessment to be useful for the child, the family, and the transition process, it has to be done several months before the child's actual 3rd birthday. What I would recommend is that ideally you would have a first assessment as a child enters early intervention. And typically a Part C program is going to do that because they're federally required to do an entry and an exit assessment. If that's not an option, I would say at least by 18 months of age, because at that point you're really expecting to have some formal language being developed, where the child would be saying or signing words if they're developing language typically. And then again, in the ideal world, you'd be continuing to do those assessments every 6 months, because that's what would be useful to the child and family, to be monitoring progress so that the family knows, do I have to change some of my decisions about what I'm doing or how I'm doing it? Or is my child progressing it the way that I want them to be? And so, probably everything that we're doing is exactly what we should be doing. Another option, if the ideal is not going to work, is to do 2 time points. And if you do that, I would recommend 24 and 33 months, because at 24 months, you really want to start seeing language exploding. And often in children who have language delay, that's not happening. And so catching it at 24 months when you still have a solid year of intervention ahead of you in an early intervention program is a great opportunity. 33 months, because now we're getting close to exit. And if you can only do it once, then I would say close to exit, but let's not think 36 months or 3 years old, because that probably is logistically going to be very difficult as the child's switching from one type of program to another. But think more 30 to 34 months of age. That coincides with when the transition planning is happening as the child's moving from early intervention to preschool or school age services. And to me, that's the closest age that you're going to be able to get, closest to exit from EI that's actually feasible. So where will you do this assessment? That's another question. I would recommend that it happens in the family's home, either in person or virtually through Zoom. Or alternatively, if the family is receiving their services in a more clinic-based situation, at the clinic during an intervention session. Both of these places are places where the family is going to feel comfortable, most likely, and also where they're likely to not be as pressed for time, as if you're doing it as a one-off in some other location. How are you going to go about this whole process? So once you decide what you're going to use, who's going to administer it, when are you going to do it, where are you going to do it, what's the process going to look like? How are you going to collect these language outcomes? So my top recommendation is for partnerships to be created between state EHDI programs and Part C programs, or deafness specialty programs that are serving children across the state or in specific areas. One of the beauties of that is that cost and resources can be shared. So for example, the assessment might be completed by personnel in the intervention program, because that has all the benefits of they know the family, they're already working with them. Ideally, the family has a trust relationship with them, and the information they gather can be used to that individual child's benefit and that individual family's benefit. And then that information ideally would be shared with the EHDI program. The EHDI program's strength is that they have a database. they can create some new fields in that database if necessary, or they may have fields already. And it would be the EHDI program's job to populate those fields and to share back program-wide reports about how the children in individual intervention programs are doing. Where are the challenges? Where are the strengths? Are there subgroups who are at higher risk for language delay? Are there characteristics that are helping some children to be more successful? If that's not going to work out, because sometimes it doesn't for a variety of reasons, some other options is to hire an evaluator that will be coordinating or conducting the assessments. That person might do the assessment in person with the family. They may go to the family's home. The family may come to a center. They might do it via Zoom. Fortunately, most language assessments for children birth to 3 work very effectively via Zoom because they don't typically require that you have direct interaction with the child. Phone interviews is a possibility. I'm kind of listing these, I guess, in decreasing order of desirability. Mail or email, if it has to come to that, or sending web links via text. So again, I would say, each of these has downsides to it, and those downsides increase as you go down that list. Then you would score the assessments, create and populate a database, and summarize the outcomes all in-house. So if an individual agency or program is doing this on their own and they're not partnering, they have to think about doing all the pieces. Or they have to think about contracting with an outside entity, such as a university program, who might do some of those tasks, whether it's actually administering the assessment or assisting with scoring or assisting with database creation or summarizing the outcomes periodically, say every 6 to 12 months. So let's talk about the documentation piece. And let me say that if you forget every single thing that I said today, if you're documenting language outcomes program-wide or statewide, please remember this one important point, because I think that you'll be really happy when it comes time to report that you remember this. So most important when you're documenting language outcomes is you need to have a field that's going to indicate whether a given child who did the assessment has additional disabilities or they don't. So, and above and beyond that, I would say there's some more things to consider. And let me just back up for a minute to say why I'm saying this is so important. I think people who have collected language outcomes and they don't know if they've come from children who have additional disabilities or not are very disappointed in the end when they put the results together. Because likely if you're assessing children who have very significant impacts because of cognitive issues or other severe needs, the average score you're going to get in the end is going to be on the lower end of the range. And it's not because the child is deaf or hard of hearing, but because of other impacts that are coming to play in their development. And so reporting that single number is like saying, well, I had one child who was doing really great and one child who was not doing very well, but as a whole, my group is doing right in the middle. And that's not a very clear picture. I think you will always want to look at both of those populations, but look at them separately. And the only way you can do that is if you have a field in the database that's going to indicate that. And so further considerations in that regard is, I would say, you don't want to just say that yes or no. You want to have some indication of those different conditions are thought to impact the child's speech and language. Because if in the group of children with additional disabilities, you have children who have problems that have been corrected, potentially a vision problem that's corrected with glasses, potentially a balance problem, which might not be thought to impact the child's language, you're not going to want those in the same group as children who have a condition like a cognitive delay that likely will impact their language development. So again, you want to separately be looking at children who have disabilities thought to impact speech and language from children who either have no other known conditions or those conditions aren't thought to impact language development. I would also say don't rely on a single checkbox that just says has disabilities and somebody clicks it if they do, because what are you going to do when that box is not clicked? Doesn't necessarily mean the child doesn't have additional disabilities. It might mean that the person who filled out the record for that child has no idea. So they had to leave it blank, or the person overlooked it or didn't ask that question. So it's critical that you have a yes, no, and maybe an unknown box, so that if it's not populated, that's just missing data. And if it is populated, you know if it's a yes or a no. Another thing you want to consider as you're thinking about a database and documenting the language outcomes is how are you going to enter scores that are out of the test range? So invariably, you're going to have some children that score below the 5th percentile, an age score of greater than 36 months. How are you going to handle that when it comes to data entry and analysis? Are you going to exclude those children in the analysis phase? Are you going to assign them a value that you think is close and acknowledge that limitation? What are you going to do with that? You also always want to have a field that has the child's chronological age when they took the test, because especially if it's an age score, it's only meaningful relative to how old the child actually was. And if you have various tests that people have done that are contributing to the database, it's critical that you've indicated these outcomes are from this test, these outcomes are from this other test. And if you're doing it at multiple points over time for a given child, you need to think about how you're going to store that so that people aren't writing over earlier results and that you have a spot to put results over the course of time. I'll just give a last couple of slides here, quick picture of how we have our EHDI database set up to document language outcomes, just to give an idea. Some of the things I've talked about with documentation. We do assess the children over time, and so this is a view showing how this particular child has 2 different time points. They've done 2 different assessments at each time point, and we see the dates that they did each of the 2 assessments, and we can keep adding more and more layers as many times as we want, as many times as we do an assessment with a given child. Here's our fields where we put in the actual outcomes, and I've circled a couple of important pieces. In red, I've circled how we're indicating if the child has additional disabilities thought to impact speech language development. So people either say yes, no, or it's unknown. If that's blank, we know it's blank, it's missing data. In orange, we've indicated what assessments we're using. So we label the assessment, and then we have fields that are specific only to that assessment, other fields that are specific only to the other assessment, so that we're not commingling our DAISY results with our MacArthur results. And then we have a spot for chronological age, and we have that for each assessment separately, because oftentimes with a young child or other competing priorities, you're not going to necessarily do 2 assessments on a given day. They may be over time, and there may be quite a lot of time that elapses between the 2. So you want to make sure you capture the child's age at both times. And then for our MacArthur, we do get a percentile rank, but we also get an age score. And so we want to calculate that developmental quotient. That's circled in green. We can just click the little developmental quotient button, and it divides the child's age score by their chronological age at the time they did the test and gives us our quotient. So that is the end of my presentation. I appreciate you staying on and listening. I know our time for questions is extremely short, but Will, if you have any questions?
Let's see if we can get some questions addressed here. Thank you so much, Allison. One of the questions, for those of you who are on, in the Q&A box, you can type your question and I'll read it aloud for Allison to answer. She also invites you to email her directly if and Allison, maybe in the chat box, you could stick your email address in there while we're reading. So the first question is, I understand the value of norm tests, but they weren't normed on children using sign language in most cases. How comfortable do you feel saying that a standard score is valid in that case?
There are limitations, there's no question about that, but it's either accept the limitations or do nothing because we do not have a sufficient number of tests that provide percentile ranks and standard scores that were normed specifically on children who are deaf or hard of hearing. There are some tests that provide age benchmarks. So we have the VCSL, we have the Sky High Language Development Scale. Both of those give you age benchmarks. They don't provide percentile ranks or standard scores. So I guess it's a little bit of a baby with the bathwater. I don't know, maybe that's not the right expression, but the idea of, what did they say? The enemy of good is perfect. So rather than like, nope, we're not going to do any standardized tests because they're not perfectly valid, I believe they're still useful. So that you have to acknowledge that they were, but it'd be like saying all tests are normed, well, not all, but almost all tests are normed on typical children because you want to compare a child to typical children. But you're giving those tests often to children that you're concerned about, who may have language delays. Those children may have visual issues. They may have hearing issues. They may use a different communication modality than the normative sample. But it doesn't necessarily mean you should never be using those assessments. I think if you went that route, that perfect route, you'd find yourself with very little you could do by way of assessment. So do I love it? No. But would I still use the assessment even if it wasn't normed on children who use sign language? Yes.
Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in, Allison. We'll see. You tell us when we need to wrap it up. Which lead case states do you see model best practices in assessments and data reporting of language outcomes with deaf and hard of hearing children?
Well, I certainly don't know all the states, so I'm a little reluctant to answer because I'm sure I'll miss somebody who will be like, wait a minute, we're doing a great job. I can say I've done a lot of work with Maine, the Maine Educational Center for the Deaf and the Hard of Hearing. They have a bill that grew out of the Lead K movement, Lead K initiative. I think they do an amazingly great job of documenting outcomes. I'm sure there's other programs, and so I don't by any means mean to leave someone out. I just don't know.
Let's ask this question. Are the MacArthur and the DAISY 2 your favorite language assessments for deaf and hard of hearing children?
The MacArthur is my favorite language assessment. The DAISY 2 has limitations. Obviously, we use it, so I don't dislike it. Would I pick something else? Maybe. But I think it's a good test. I love the MacArthur.
Great. How small of a data group do you think it would be worth doing this with? 10 kids a year, 20, 100?
That's a super good question. I think you need at least 10 because averages are not very meaningful when you have 6 or 7. It's too influenced by one individual child. The average that you have is not really looking across a good group of kids. 10 is often, when you talk about suppressing data in an article, 10 is often the recommended number. Don't report if there's less than 10. The tricky thing, though, is like, let's say you have 10 kids, but 3 of them have unilateral differences. The other 7 have bilateral. 4 of them have additional disabilities. 6 of them don't. You don't really have a group of 10 anymore because you're not going to throw all of those characteristics together. Likely, you're going to want to look at unilateral separate from bilateral, with additional disabilities separate from does not have additional disabilities. And so you really need to look at your number in that subgroup and think about analyzing and reporting only when you have 10 in the subgroup that you're going to report on.
Next question or comment. You've helped me appreciate how complicated this is if I were going to do this well, and how much we would need someone with your expertise, especially with the Odyssey project ending. What kind of a person would we hire if we want to collect language outcome data in a quality way?
I would look to universities or intervention programs that you admire. So there are many strong intervention programs specific to children who are deaf or hard of hearing, and those are the ones I'm mainly aware of, but I'm sure there's also very strong intervention programs that serve a variety of children, birth to 3. I would look to those programs that you admire or that you've heard good things about. See if somebody from the program, ask them what they're doing. If you like it, consult with them. If you have a university, either in your area or that you know about, and they have someone on their faculty who's interested in language acquisition in children who are deaf or hard of hearing, that might be a good consultant as well.
When will the Odyssey project be ending?
It will be ending in 11 months. So it ends August 31st of next year.
We have so many questions that we're not going to be able to get to today, but thank you, Allison, for for your time with us today, and everybody for your attention. Allison's email is in the chat, so feel free to jot that down. If you also look in the chat, you'll see a link to today's evaluation of today's webinar that will also generate a certificate of attendance in today's webinar. So thank you very much, Allison, for all the time you put into preparing your presentation for us and for all the work that you do to promote best practices, as you said, even if it's only defined by Allison. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to our captioner and to our interpreters as well. This webinar has been recorded and will be on our website, infanthearing.org, probably Monday or Tuesday of next week. So if you need to share this information with others or review it again, you can do it there. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye, friends. Have a good rest of your day.
Too.